Welcome to the deep dive. You know the ritual, probably because you lived it this morning.
Yeah, we all do it.
Right. You wake up, you haven't even thrown the covers off yet, and you reach for your phone, you open an app, you start scrolling through the headlines, and almost immediately you feel this massive, crushing weight settle onto your chest.
Oh, absolutely. The doom scroll is real.
It is. We talk about the economy, political strife, systemic failures. We talk about how society is just completely broken. It feels like this heavy physical architecture pressing down on you, you know?
Like it's a tangible thing.
Exactly. We look at it like we're looking at a map, pointing at borders and institutions, assuming they are as solid as concrete. But what if you were pointing at a ghost? What if that massive, crushing architecture you feel doesn't actually exist?
It is a genuinely uncomfortable proposition, honestly. We invest an incredible amount of mental energy and, well, emotional bandwidth into battling these huge external concepts.
The system, right,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
state.
Yes, the system, the state, society at large. To suggest that these concepts are essentially illusions, just linguistic conveniences that we've mistaken for reality, it completely upends how we process modern life.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because today, our mission is to figure out why we feel so constantly overwhelmed by information overload and all these global crises. And we are doing it by examining a deeply radical thesis.
And it is radical.
Very. We're looking at excerpts from a text called Rapporto dalla Dimensione X, specifically Chapter 10, which is titled Spiritualità e Società, or Spirituality and Society.
Right.
This chapter contains communications from a source identified simply as Entity A. Now, just to be perfectly clear, our goal here isn't to endorse this text, right? We're not presenting it as absolute truth or taking any political sides.
No, not at all. We were just looking at the source material.
Exactly. We are here to impartially examine its core paradigm-shifting argument. The claim that the solution to a broken world is never found out there in society because society is just a mirror. The solution is found entirely in here within the individual.
To understand the mechanics of why Entity A makes such a sweeping claim, we really had to start at the foundation of how this text defines a human being.
Which is pretty unique.
Very unique. According to the source material, you do not simply appear on Earth as a blank slate. You arrive carrying a very specific spiritual program.
Like a blueprint.
Like a blueprint, exactly.
Yeah.
It outlines a set of broad directives for your personal spiritual evolution.
And what I found so compelling is that this blueprint doesn't manifest as like some glowing aura or mystical energy field in your daily life.
No, it's not esoteric like that.
Right. It gets translated into extremely ordinary, gritty, earthly channels. Your commute, your job, your mundane interactions. Entity A emphasizes that spiritual markers, things like your capacity for charity or your threshold for pity or just like a strong ethical drive, they are entirely universal.
Right. The external situation doesn't change the internal drive.
Yeah, they operate exactly the same way whether you are a barista dealing with a customer who is screaming about a misspelled name on a cup or a CEO navigating a hostile corporate takeover.
The profession, or really any earthly circumstance, is merely the testing ground. The underlying causal force is that spiritual drive.
Oh.
But the text highlights an immediate friction point here. This spiritual being, carrying an internal evolutionary program, gets dropped into a terrestrial environment that is perpetually chaotic.
Mildly.
Yeah. Entity A observes quite dryly that Earth has never truly known an era of total peace. It is an inherently imperfect, abrasive environment.
So we have these spiritual beings navigating what is essentially an endless obstacle course. And when we look around at the chaos, the inequality, the wars, we instinctively point our fingers at the state or the nation.
Right. We blame the structure.
You blame the structure, but Entity A strips that away completely. A state is literally defined in the text as nothing more than a grouping of individual human beings residing in a specific territory.
Yeah.
There is no independent, breathing entity called the state.
The text really forces us to confront the mythology we've built around human institutions. Society does not have a hind. It does not have agency. It is purely a descriptive term.
Just a label.
Exactly. The only tangible, actual reality in this entire equation is the individual human being.
I struggle to accept that at face value, though. I mean, it sounds a bit too reductive, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, let's look at it like a forest. You can argue that a forest is just a collection of individual trees, but a forest has an actual ecosystem.
True.
The canopy blocks the sun, creating shade that dictates what kind of moss can grow. The root systems share nutrients underground. The forest as a whole creates a distinct environment that heavily dictates the life of a single tree. You can't just pretend the forest doesn't exist.
What's fascinating here is how Entity A anticipates that exact kind of systemic macro-level thinking, which dominates our modern worldview, by the way, and it essentially rejects it as a valid tool for healing.
Wait, it rejects the ecosystem idea?
Not exactly. The text does not deny that an environment influences people. What it argues is that by constantly zooming out to analyze the abstraction, the sick forest, as you put it, we give ourselves a psychological out.
Oh, I see.
We use the systemic sickness as an excuse to avoid treating the rot in our own individual roots. Entity A is uncompromising on this point. You cannot cure a sick society by applying medicine to the concept of society.
Because the concept isn't real.
Right. If a society is unjust or chaotic, the causality is strictly bottom-up. It is because it is made up of unjust and chaotic individuals. Healing the whole is mathematically impossible without first healing the parts.
So it's a total refusal to let us off the hook. We can't blame an invisible boogeyman.
Exactly.
But if we follow that logic, it brings up a glaring contradiction for me. If we are all just these individual spirits operating on a spiritual blueprint meant for personal evolution, why on earth did we build such rigid, stressful, and often deeply unequal hierarchical structures to live in?
That is the big question.
Right, like if the core of humanity is spiritual, why did we invent the capitalist rat race?
Entity A actually provides a mechanical explanation for this. The text argues that the urge to organize ourselves is actually a pure, uncorrupted spiritual instinct. It just severely misfired.
Misfired how?
Well, the inherent drive of the spirit is altruistic. A spirit instinctively tends toward other spirits. It recognizes a shared frequency, is attracted to it, and wants to form a group to elevate the condition of everyone involved.
The text even gives us a glimpse of what this grouping looks like when it functions correctly, right? In the spiritual realm, this natural grouping forms what Entity A calls nuri.
Right.
These are harmonious groups of highly evolved spirits living in perfect, unbroken synchronization. They group together based entirely on spiritual affinity.
Yeah, it's an alignment.
Imagine a tuning fork vibrating. It naturally seeks out another fork vibrating at the exact same frequency. There are no social classes in the spiritual realm, no feudal lords, no billionaires, just harmonious alignment based on evolutionary progress.
But the breakdown happens when that pure instinct is subjected to gravity, so to speak. You drop that deep spiritual urge to connect into the earthly environment.
Things get messy.
Very messy, because the earthly environment is defined by biological needs, material scarcity, and survival instincts. The human feels the urge to form a community, but the execution gets distorted by the material conditions.
Survival of the fittest kicks in.
Exactly. Instead of organizing by spiritual affinity, humanity historically divided itself along lines of power and resource hoarding. The strong dominated the weak in primitive times. As societies became more complex, that morphed into the rich separating from the poor.
So we took our deepest spiritual desire for community and accidentally weaponized it into a class system.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
And Entity A makes a point that kind of blew my mind. The spirit itself, that foundational blueprint, actually doesn't care about fixing the earthly environment.
Not at all.
To the spirit, Earth is just a temporary gymnasium. It will adapt its internal evolutionary exercises to whatever the external conditions are, whether you are living in a utopian commune or a dystopian dictatorship.
This explains the historical failure of purely structural revolutions. We constantly try to satisfy a deep spiritual hunger by rearranging social hierarchies, and it consistently leaves us starving.
Because it's the wrong medicine.
Right. We mistake the earthly channel for the spiritual goal.
Which perfectly sets up the human reflex. We look around, we see that the social hierarchy is unjust, and we decide to write a new rule. We try to legislate our way out of the sickness. We pass a law and say, okay, society is fixed.
And we know how well that works.
Yeah. Entity A asserts that legislation is a completely hollow approach to genuine healing.
The text draws a hard line between social modification and spiritual modification. A law is mechanically neutral. It is just ink on a page. A law does not contain morality. It only contains enforcement. Entity A points out that humanity has never seen an unjust, spiritually sick society magically transform into a good society simply because a new piece of legislation was passed.
But if legislation is just paper and preaching is just hot air, Entity A is basically saying we have zero systemic tools to fix the world. That sounds incredibly bleak, honestly.
It sounds that way at first.
Let's go back to my forest analogy, or let's use a traffic light. Laws are like traffic lights. A red light at a busy intersection prevents massive deadly crashes. It physically stops the chaos.
Sure.
Are we supposed to believe that just because a traffic light doesn't teach you how to be a considerate driver, we should tear it down?
If we connect this to the bigger picture the text is drawing, entity A wouldn't say tear down the traffic light.
Yeah.
But the text would argue that your traffic light only functions because of a pre-existing internal spiritual agreement among the drivers to value human life enough to step on the brake.
Oh, wow. Okay.
If you remove that internal spiritual yeast from the population, the traffic light is just a blinking bulb that an angry, spiritually inert driver will completely ignore.
That makes total sense.
Entity A views human history as a massive machine with interlocking gears. The very first lever, the one that powers the entire mechanism, is the interior life of the human being. You cannot operate this machine from the outside in.
So the ideology doesn't matter if the people are broken.
Exactly. If you have grand utopian ideologies but an uneducated, spiritually hollow population, your ideology remains purely theoretical.
Which brings up the text's alternative to preaching and lawmaking. Entity A offers a concept called esemplificazione, or exemplification.
Yes.
It's the brutal, unglamorous act of simply living the virtue yourself. When you model your life on moral norms, when you actually embody the patience, the charity, the ethics preaching becomes obsolete.
Because your actions do the talking.
Right. Your daily life becomes the concrete, indisputable evidence of how the world should operate. You don't tell the forest to heal, you just become a healthy tree.
And it requires an immense amount of personal accountability. It is infinitely easier to stand on a soapbox and to claim that society is sick than to do the grueling internal work of aligning your biological actions with your spiritual blueprint.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because this strikes at the absolute core of the listener's daily reality. We live in an era of unprecedented, widely broadcast crisis. We feel neurotic, we are exhausted, we are totally imbalanced.
Constantly.
And our immediate reflex is to blame the news cycle. We say, I am stressed because of the ideological battles in the government. I am anxious because the economy is faltering. We use the external world as a scapegoat.
The text aggressively rejects that premise. Entity A states explicitly, I do not believe great collective problems cause neurosis.
That is a wild statement to make today.
I know. The source material diagnoses our modern anxiety not as a reaction to external events, but as a severe internal malfunction. It is a profound lack of inner equilibrium stemming from the clash between two opposing forces within us.
Unpack that clash for us, because this is the psychological engine of the whole argument.
Yeah.
What are those two forces?
On one side, you have biological egoism. This is the physical imperative to survive, to gather resources, to protect yourself, to eat. It is inherently self-centered.
Okay.
On the other side, you have spiritual altruism. This is the blueprint's drive to connect, to share, to form those harmonious neurali we talked about earlier.
You're right, the tuning forks.
Exactly. Modern neurosis is the cognitive dissonance created when these two forces are at war. You want to act with charity and connection, but your biological fear of losing your social standing or your job forces you into selfish behavior.
So we're just tearing ourselves apart.
Yes. The friction between who you are biologically forced to be and who you are spiritually meant to be generates massive internal heat. We take that heat, point it at the television, and call it political anxiety.
Entity A describes our current generation as having reached a state of deep immaturity. And it clarifies that this doesn't mean we are intellectually stunted. I mean, we have supercomputers in our pockets, but we are internally paralyzed. We are trapped in a drama where old, hypocritical moral codes, things we know are false, are violently clashing with an authentic spiritual life that we subconsciously refuse to accept because it's too demanding. We don't know who we are, so we just vibrate with stress.
This raises an important question. If the collective problems of society are largely an illusion, masking our internal dysfunction, who are we actually fighting?
Ourselves, basically.
Yes. We feel like we are in a continuous, exhausting battle against an antagonistic world. We view ourselves as isolated islands surrounded by a hostile sea. But Entity A reminds us that we are the actors creating the very world we are terrified of.
Oh, man.
Your personal failure to reconcile your spiritual blueprint with your earthly actions ripples out and degrades the psychology of the people around you.
So what does this all mean? We are looking at a macro crisis, a planet full of neurotic, exhausted people pointing fingers at a phantom called society. If the cause is entirely internal, the solution is entirely internal.
There is no other way.
Entity A makes it clear that engaging with the world's problems does not mean starting a revolution in the streets. Rearranging the external furniture doesn't cure the disease. The only true revolution is executing a revolution inside your own spirit.
The text refers to this as the most anti-historical act a person can undertake.
Anti-historical, how so?
But well, we live in a deeply materialistic era where history measures progress by GDP, technological milestones, and shifting borders. To
Hmm.
pause all of that, to look inward and reaffirm the unseen value of your own spirit so that your life doesn't just become an arid mechanical routine, that is the ultimate act of rebellion against the modern world.
And the beautiful synthesis of NTTA's argument is that focusing intensely on your internal spiritual life doesn't mean you are abandoning the rest of humanity. It's the exact opposite.
Right.
By finding your spiritual vocation and living it through exemplification, you trigger a positive cascade. The text calls it a vicious circle of good. You cannot improve your own spiritual equilibrium without that stability bleeding out into your environment, naturally benefiting the collective.
It restores a sense of profound agency. You cannot fix the world out there. The weight of global crises is not yours to carry because the globe, as an abstract concept, doesn't need saving.
Only people do.
Individual humans do, yes.
Yeah.
Your only true obligation is to execute your own spiritual blueprint with integrity.
Let's bring it all the way back to that morning ritual. You look at your phone, you see the crushing architecture of the world, and you feel despair. But if society doesn't actually exist as an independent entity, if it is truly nothing more than a giant mirror reflecting the millions of individual human choices standing in front of it, it changes everything.
It shifts the entire paradigm of how you live your day.
It really does.
Yeah.
But that leads to a much larger, almost dizzying thought to leave you with. If society is an illusion, and all that matters is the invisible internal evolution of the individual spirit, what does that mean for human history? For all our great empires, our political movements, our sweeping historical eras, nothing more than a meaningless stage play, mere scenery for the actual invisible evolution happening entirely offstage, quietly,